Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited about today's guest, another fan favorite. We've been doing a string of fan favorites of late. And today, of course, I'm referring to National Review film critic Ross Douthat, who also occasionally appears in the New York Times and occasionally writes books about stuff, including
intermittent podcaster Ross Douthat.
That's
probably the best. Occasional Remnant guest Ross Douthat is how I asked to be introduced at most speaking engagements.
Husband of famous cat author.
Yep.
By the way, I still feel bad. I've never had Mrs. Douthat on here to talk about cats. If she's still available for plugging the book, I would be happy to have her on here.
Oh, I'll mention it to her. She is currently locked away in our office working on another book. This is a periodic phase of our married life. Is that she has to go into the attic, not like the first Mrs. Rochester, but to produce books. So she's working on another one. But I will mention it to her. She's
if you see her,
If I see her, I mean, it's unclear, Yeah, it's been a few weeks.
I'm very familiar with marital division of labor for book writing, organizational issues, having a similar issue with my own lovely bride. But my wife manages to fly to really expensive, nice places when she wants to write a book, which annoys me sometimes. But
that is a good gig.
Yeah,
if you can get it.
Yes, a topic for another time. Anyway, Ross's new book is Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, and we will get to that in a moment. But first, I wanted to talk to you about get a little rank punditry adjacent stuff out of the way.
Let's do it.
We're recording today on January 29th, 2025. And how would you say the first week or so of the new Trump era, the new golden age? I'm sorry, the new golden age is going. Does it feel golden to you? Bronze, maybe?
I mean, it seems like there's sort of too many things happening to even do rank punditry. I feel like you could do a whole swathe of punditry.
Brits say swathe. Americans say swath.
Yeah, I guess I'll sort of try and be sort of simplistic. I think the Trump administration's war on wokeness and DEI is going very well. Without sort of saying definitively the impact of every executive order.
Sure.
I think that there is a sort of an effective meeting of a cultural moment of just sort of total exhaustion and a desire to be done with a lot of this stuff, with the kind of aggressive, let's try all the things that past Republican administrations were too gutless to try spirit of the new Trump administration. So I think in that zone, things are going well for Trump 2.0. We've just gone through a several-day period where we had what seemed like a return to the old style, the chaotic style of the first Trump administration, where they announced this temporary freeze of some super large category of federal spending, supposedly while they went through and found all the things that were the grants and disbursements that could be rolled back or walked back, or redirected or something. But the initial order seemed vague and general and incredibly large and dubiously constitutional. And so then you get the outcry, and then the next day the order is changed. And then, people in the Trump White House say, the media was once again misinterpreting or misreporting what we were doing. And all of that, I'm sure all of that will have changed again by the time we finished the podcast. But that seemed like, a sort of case study in, basically you can say the Trump White House right now has, they have smarter people working on the things that they want to do, the aggressive things they want to do, than they did last time. That's clear. People who have thought a bit more about what a kind of, remaking of the administrative state would look like than last time. At the same time, they are clearly intent on doing this kind of shock and awe, as many orders as possible in the first 3 weeks kind of thing. And clearly, in some cases, that desire is outstripping even the increased capabilities relative to the first time around. But again, we haven't that's rank punditry, but we haven't even talked about what's going on in foreign policy. The stuff that's going on with AI right now, in which the Trump administration is sort of a secondary player, but did in fact, bring out the big AI gang to announce, a big new data center investment. That stuff's really big potentially, and how you weigh that against, whatever Trump wants to do to, get federal workers to do buyouts is sort of, it's a challenge in terms of doing analysis, figuring out what is actually important for the next 4 years as opposed to a story for the next couple months.
Yeah, so I didn't love. I have enormous respect for Bret Stephens. I think he's a great columnist. He's your colleague at the New York Times. I didn't love his his Never Trump, Nevermore column for a couple different ways. In part because when I wrote basically the same thing in 2016 after Trump won, I got attacked for it from a whole bunch of people. But I think part of his point, which is one I agree with, is it really is important not to get caught up in the controversy du jour and go to 11 on everything, right? Because some of these things, where's the signal and where's the noise is always hard with Trump. I have a little on my pundit cockpit. I have this little panel, this little sort of odometer thing, and it goes from on one end Chauncey Gardner, and the needle goes all the way to the other end of Lonesome Rhodes. And I bring this up for you because you're a cinephile and you'll get the references. But for a lot of other people, Chauncey Gardner is the Peter Sellers character from Being There, who is basically like a sub 80 IQ guy who through a series of fortuitous events, people mistake as this brilliant and sage guy because he speaks in metaphors about gardening. And he gets set up at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, to be the next president of the United States, but he doesn't know what he's doing, right? And then Lonesome Rhodes is this incredibly folksy guy who seems like he doesn't really know very much, but is in fact incredibly conniving and sinister, from what I think is one of the best movies ever made, Facing the Crowd. And Trump, I think, sometimes goes from one to the other. And the difference now, I think you're right, is that Steve Miller and a lot of these guys know where they went wrong the first time and are very clever. And so, the only reason I bring this up is this suspension of aid thing, which I woke out of a NyQuil stupor to try to get my head around yesterday. The fact that they got it wrong the first time, I can make a very plausible case that they intentionally got it wrong to create chaos, to freak people out, to sort of smoke out certain kinds of critics, to blame the media. Or I could totally believe that they just screwed it up at the first time around and had to redo it. And I think we're just going to see a lot of these things where the to be a spinal tap, make a spinal tap reference, the line between clever and stupid is going to be really hard to find sometimes in some of these things.
Right. Well, and I mean, very clearly part of the, it's not just Stephen Miller, right? It's that this version of the Trump era has Elon Musk in particular, but then a whole host of very, very smart people from Silicon Valley who would have wanted to be nowhere near Trump 2016, but who now are sort of eager and active and taking jobs in the administration and so on. And the Silicon Valley ethos is, the phrase "move fast and break things" gets overused, right? But that line is used to describe the Silicon Valley mentality for a reason. It's a very, very entrepreneurial, very let's try a bunch of things that haven't been tried before. And I think that's likely to produce actually some genuinely interesting moves in terms of, sort of trying to get your arms around the Leviathan that is the federal government. But it also means that you're essentially saying a lot of the time, well, no one's tried this before. Seems like we could do it. Let's see what happens. And that's also a good recipe for having things that you need to walk back very, very quickly. I mean, I think one of the core questions that that I think we'll see play out over the next whatever period of time, right, is that you and I both go back a ways to different eras, prior eras in American politics. We remember the misty days of the Tea Party and the fiscal cliff and the endless arguments between, or negotiations, not arguments, negotiations, friendly negotiations between Barack Obama and John Boehner and so on over federal spending, right? And I mean, one of the main lessons that I took away from that entire era, years and years of debating the minutiae of federal spending, was that, in fact, saying we're just going to cut $1 trillion here, find these huge amounts of savings, is something that you can only do either at sort of high tides of bipartisanship that are unlikely to come again, or in moments of sort of either real or sort of forced crisis, right? You can't just come in and come up with some clever budget guy's idea and be like, oh, everyone's missed this. We can cut 500 billion really easily and there will be no backlash. Now, if you talk to people involved with the Trump White House right now, and again, I think especially some of the Silicon Valley guys who are new to Washington and new to its ways, there's a lot of confidence that that's the old paradigm, right? And in fact, you, maybe not you and I, but pundits like us and budget wonks and everyone else were sort of trapped in the limited horizons imposed by the Potomac River or something. And in fact, if you get the smartest guys in the world, the guys who built these amazing companies out west, and turn them loose on the federal government, they'll figure out interesting ways, really transformative things, not just like we've zeroed out 6 programs that studied an endangered fish or something. I interviewed Mark Andreessen for
I was going to ask you about that.
The Times podcast, and that was sort of where our conversation ended up. We covered a whole range of things on his evolution and how Silicon Valley has turned right, and it was all really, really interesting. And then at the end, I was like, but look, what do you think Doge is really going to accomplish? And that was the argument I've just made is basically the argument he made to me, that, it's what is different this time is that Elon Musk, a man who, built the most successful technology startups in modern history and figured out that you could run Twitter on 1/4 the staff, that he's going to figure out some things that, Paul Ryan and a bunch of congressional budget wonks couldn't. And I'm very skeptical, but that it's important to know that is like part of the narrative at work. That is again not just like Stephen Miller and sort of Trump 1.0 guys who understand government better. It's also sort of new blood who think that they can succeed where, past tamers of Washington failed.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about the Andreessen thing. I like Mark Andreessen. I think I am shunt to him for reasons I cannot completely understand, but as the Amish might say. But and I listened to that interview, and there was a lot of it I found very interesting, and I will put it in the show notes. I highly recommend it to people. And without dwelling on the Andreessen part, that general argument, I'm totally open to the idea, and it sounds like this is sort of where Musk is going with Doge now that he's gotten rid of the forehead with an appetite known as Vivek Ramaswamy. He has moved to sort of actually having a singular idea of what Doge is going to be about sort of streamlining systems. That's something he understands, and it's not just trying to be all things to all people. And I wish these guys nothing but luck. But not to sound too puffed up, but let us say that you and I are students of history. And
sorry. Yes. I mean, yes, we are.
That's right. So,
I reached for my cigar.
Yeah. You're more of a pipe guy, but anyway, the idea of bringing somebody in from business to run the government like a business, or Herbert Hoover ran with one of his main slogans was, "Do you want a politician to be president or an engineer, because back then he was probably the most famous engineer in the world, right? And there is, I don't want to go all Michael Oakeshott on you because you're one of the few people who I have on this podcast who could actually correct me if I get him wrong. But like this idea of government as sort of a enterprise, so as a business, is profoundly flawed, and it, like these bad category errors, these false analogies. You know, this is one of the reasons why I despised all this time, which Kamala Harris reprised, FDR's thing about bold, persistent experimentation. Like the American people are not lab rats for the government to experiment on, right? You can't say, well, let's see what happens if we take this kind of property away from them, right? They have rights. Their rights are prior to the existence of government. They come from God, not from government. And you also don't have the kind of goodwill that is required to A/B test things, right, on the American people. It's like, hey, make all these investments with this idea that the government's going to do X. Oh, it's turning out that's not going to work. Sucks for all you. Here are your stranded costs. Go choke on them. And the idea that somehow Silicon Valley is such a different kind of business that, it's going to work where all the other bad analogies going back to William James and the moral equivalent to war stuff didn't work. This one will. I'm skeptical. The only reason I'm not skeptical is a very depressing thought that we've so digitized our lives that maybe the owners of all of these social media companies can manipulate the public and make the public legible, as James C. Scott would put it, in ways that can make this kind of thing work that, engineers and generals couldn't. But politics is politics, government is government, and and you can only spend $1 once, and those rules do not change just because you get the smartest guys from one sector of the economy involved.
Right. I mean, I think if you say, I think what is distinctive about this moment is that for various reasons, the party of government, which is the Democrats, right, historically.
For sure.
Obviously, we have two parties of government in practice, but in theory, the party of government, the party that is most effective at arguing for government, defending government, and making the American people believe that Republicans are a mortal threat to everything that people like about government, is back on its heels in a really profound way, a way we haven't seen in a long time. This will probably not last. But what's distinctive about this moment is the Democrats didn't just lose an election; they also lost a culture war.
Yeah,
and they're really not used to having lost culture wars. Like that's just
I agree.
That's not how the world is supposed to work. It's like, all right, you lose some elections to Republicans, and that stinks. But except for this brief post 9/11 moment, I would say there's never been a moment when Democrats have felt like they're losing the culture wars, and now there is, and
that's the real vibe shift. I agree with you.
That's the real vibe shift, but it bleeds over into political battle. So they're
for sure,
and I think that does create openings that did not exist for Paul Ryan. Certainly that, Republicans have very slim control of the House, but they do have unified control of government. You have a Republican Supreme Court. And there are going to be, I think, opportunities for doing clever deregulatory things, clever cancellations of grants and so on that are going to fit, that are going to fit within the constitutional framework that would not have occurred to prior Republican administrations. I think that is real. I also think, though, and here's where we probably agree, and would be seen as like old-fashioned losers, right? New breed is that that's going to be most effective on the margins. Like, yes, maybe Musk and company can use the lever of work from home, canceling work from home, to get 10% of the federal workforce to take a buyout, and you can change the character of the federal workforce on the margin in ways that makes it easier for Republicans to govern. That could absolutely be true. That's not the same thing as cutting, $1 trillion in federal spending, right? And I think, and it may be that people, Andreessen in our conversation referenced the Al Gore reinventing government, right? If you see Musk as promising to fix the federal budget, but really delivering the kind of based version of reinventing government, then you could say, okay, well, maybe he'll succeed, and the big promises are just sort of puffery. But in fact, there's actually stuff under the hood in terms of personnel and policy that can change. The more puffed up it is, the more I assume that it will come to grief. And you see that with this order, right? It's like, again, I think there are undoubtedly a lot of things that the Biden administration did with where Congress appropriated funds and the Biden administration decided how to spend them in ways that the Trump administration probably has the power to change. But that has to be seen as something that is happening on the margin, and if you frame it as, oh, guess what, guys, we're suspending 1/3 of what the federal government spends money on while we figure this out, you're not going to win the political battle.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I will say, like, I've been making the point a lot that that executive orders are exaggerated in their importance, right? They're most of them are basically political press releases that sound grandiose, but even the best ones, they're only last as long as, your party's in power, right? Because the next president can get rid of them. I don't think that's the case. I mean, correct me if you're wrong, it's part of this vibe shift thing, right? Like, a Democrat would have to campaign on saying, and we're going to restore all this DEI stuff if they were going to do an executive order once elected. And I don't think there's any Democrat that wants to run on that. For the time, if the current moment extends long enough that it looks a little like this in 2027, 28, right?
Right. No, I think it is an example of how important sort of the culture and the culture war really is, that you can do certain things if you feel like you have the cultural wind at your back that are exactly as you say. Like, it seemed impossible in certain ways to imagine a Republican administration doing away with affirmative action in federal contracting, because that was just not no Republican. I mean, Reagan wanted to do it and didn't, and it was like, oh, you'll be called racist and the business community will be against you and all these things. In 2024, the sort of overreach of the left was substantial enough that you could get this kind of pendulum swing back that took you all the way to just doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in just doing it, then you create a situation where the Democrats are like, well, the next Democratic president is going to restore, you're going to restore DEI in federal contracting. You're going to just restore racial discrimination against non-minority contractors. It's just going to be a harder lift. But it's an example, I think, of sort of, I think people on the right who say, this just shows that we could have done, we just needed an aggressive president all along, aren't quite right. It's that you can do aggressive things when your enemies have driven their own sort of popular ideas into a ditch, in ways that would have been, just much harder to pull off absent. Like, the age of wokeness made it possible to do things against the left that were not possible in the previous dispensation.
So, speaking of the cultural shift, we are all very comfortable. I mean, I was very good friends with Andrew Breitbart. It always kind of bothered me that, like, he got ownership of this idea that politics is downstream of culture, which is like a very Moynihan kind of, like, I bet you if you did an etymology of it or a history of it, the idea's been around for a long time, but it's associated with Andrew, this idea that, politics is downstream of culture. It seems like part of the problem is, like, business decisions, artistic decisions are made on a time scale and time frame that don't necessarily line up with politics. But the record-setting number of Oscar nominations for Emilia Perez seems particularly ill-timed for the political moment. I have not seen it.
I will admit that I have not seen it either.
Is that right?
So,
Well, John Podhoretz saw it, and he gave me the full account. I first heard about it while walking my dogs. I don't know if you know this. I walk my dogs a lot, and I heard the NPR coverage of it, and I checked the date to see if it was April 1st. I mean, I just assumed it was a parody, and but the only reason I bring it up is, do you think that the vibe shift is such that we could see a moment where culture is downstream of politics, which is not a place I normally would like to be, right? I don't like, there's something vaguely Stalin-esque or, or new Soviet about that kind of thing. But do you get the sense that that might be the case?
It's all, what's the lame cop out? It's all, everything is downstream of everything else, right?
Yeah.
So like Trump winning re-election ratifies a certain kind of cultural shift. There are people for whom it's like it's real because he won. Even though, the actual difference between winning 51-49 and losing 50-49, is not actually immense, right? But
Right.
nonetheless, the victory creates conditions in which it is possible to feel like you can, say certain things, make certain arguments, create certain works of art, all of these things. However, Trump won in part because of a cultural vibe shift that had already happened. Joe Rogan would not have had Donald Trump on, let alone endorsed him, right, in 2016, because back then Joe Rogan was a libertarian-leaning liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Because none of the woke era stuff had fully happened, and all of the kind of podcast bros, right, that Trump, possibly through Barron Trump's influence, went on, the Theo Vaughns, these kind of things. These people were not cultural figures 5 or 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of my working theories is that the internet has delivered fragmentation and then consolidation and then fragmentation again. So first you had the internet shows up and suddenly everybody's got a blog, everybody, it's like, the army of Davids against the Goliaths, right? That was the Glenn Reynolds thing, right? And so it's like fragmentation. But then the social media companies come along and join with, a media industry where small newspapers have all died and small magazines are in trouble, but the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are still big. And suddenly you get to the late 2010s and it seems like there's 4 internet companies and 3 media companies, and you're in an age of consolidation again. And that was sort of wokeness sort of fastened on that era where it was like, okay, you can have a ruling ideology that will be expressed through a small number of institutions, and everyone can, and these institutions will police, they'll police for misinformation, they'll say, you can't talk about the lab leak hypothesis on Twitter and it'll just disappear, right? This kind of thing. But now, for whatever reason, that moment seems to have passed and we're back to fragmentation again. And so fragmentation means tons and tons of big podcasts that aren't actually that big, right, as huge parts of the media environment. All of these sort of micro communities that, Harris going on Call Her Daddy, right, was like a similar kind of thing. And her campaign just wasn't as good at handling this environment. But all of that happened before Trump won. And his victory was downstream of that kind of change. Like just the shift, just something like, Substack existing as a kind of zone of refuge for people forced out of prominent institutions during the great purges of 2019 and 2020. That created, again, a changed media ecosystem that preceded Trump's win, but again, that Trump's win then ratifies and sort of takes further. I mean, I think the question, I'm really unsure about what happens in Hollywood and TV right now. As you know, I wrote a book about decadence that came out, I guess, 5 years ago now, that was all about sort of stagnation and stuckness and repetition in the culture. And I think in various ways, for better or worse, we're breaking out of some forms of that decadence in politics, in tech, in science, right? In certain areas, maybe religion, which is my new book, right? It's about religion.
We're about to pivot to that in a moment.
We'll pivot, but before the pivot, my concern is I'm not sure about movies and TV. They still are pop culture, the culture, the big culture, not the podcasts, but the big entertainment still feel stuck, and I don't know exactly how they get out of that. Part of it is that they overbuilt during the everyone was at home watching TV era, the COVID era, and then there was like a streaming bubble, and then it burst. So Hollywood is in financial trouble. So that's a problem for creativity. Creativity can always use surplus, but yeah, I feel like the movies and TV just feel really stagnant right now in a way that the rest of the culture doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, so like, the thing I think is interesting about the Emilia Perez thing, there are a bunch of interesting things. I think the backlash against it in Mexico is fantastic. Where the average Mexican, there's a stampede of people demanding their money back, and they think it's racist, and they think it's like outrageous.
Right, weird. It's as I understand it, it's a much weird. It's not as simple as a woke movie about a trans.
Right. I mean, I think the thing that annoys a lot of Mexicans more than the trans stuff is making light of these drug cartels, which are destroying their country, right, and murdering people, and like, oh, this guy's great, but what I think is sort of the way it ties to the politics stuff is just that Democrats have basically learned over the last generation only to speak essentially in one language, which is this post-civil rights era language of if you disagree with us, you're racist or bad, right? Or you're uncaring, or you want to hurt people. It's that kind of formulation. Government is the thing that prevents bad things from happening. So that's why libertarians get to be called racist too, which has always been sort of ridiculous to me. And then all of a sudden, those arguments just didn't work, right? So like Emilia Perez is kind of like is Latinx on a grand scale, right? Is speaking in this language that claims to be for the oppressed, and the oppressed, or the quote unquote oppressed, are like, actually, we want lower egg prices. We want, like the economy to work. We want these normal things. You're not speaking for us. And I think the vibe shift for Democrats is that they don't have a new language right now about politics, because they can't double down on the identity politics stuff. And they can't really go to the Bernie bro rhetoric because Trump has co-opted so much of that.
Well, and also the Bernie bro rhetoric was suited to a moment in the mid 2010s when interest rates were super low.
Yeah.
And the economy was growing slowly, and we had a lot of room for, frankly, Keynesianism, right? Like which Trump did right-wing Keynesianism in his first term. Had Bernie been elected, he would have done left-wing Keynesianism. But the problem for the left right now is inflation is, inflation kills all governments that preside over it, but it's particularly bad for the left because the left wants to promise to spend money, and what can't you do under inflationary conditions? Spend more money. But also it just feels to me like we have reached a kind of limit of that sort of wokeness pushed social liberalism to a kind of maximum, and now we have a backlash, right? But it's like, well, where do you go past that? What's the next horizon of social liberalism? Unclear. Obamacare sort of partially completed, not fully, obviously. Bernie still, you can still talk about Medicare for all, but it partially completed the project of the liberal welfare state. So there's just, it's like, well, where do you go from here? And then you're sort of thrown back on liberalism as just a kind of, a sort of attitude towards the universe, and frankly, as an attitude towards the universe, and maybe I will use this to begin pitching my new book, right? But the secular liberalism as an attitude towards the universe has some big problems that by itself, it not universally, but it risks sort of throwing people into a kind of anomie and existential anxiety and despair. And that's where I think a lot of sort of progressive culture has ended up. Very pessimistic about human beings, their place in the universe, and the future of the human race, which is a rough place to be.
So, since you brought it up and you stole my ability to have a brilliant segue,
I always be selling, Jonah.
I get it. So I listened to all but the last 10 minutes of a podcast you did. I don't want to get the name wrong. Faith Matters. Is that what it was? Yeah. And it was very interesting to me. I'm completely open to correction here because this is not my beat, as you know, even though you have just written a book about why it should be, and it should be everybody's.
Everyone.
Yeah.
The publishers rejected the subtitle "Why Jonah Goldberg." should be religious for some reason. That was my original subtitle, but
My ears were burning as I was listening
yep.
to that. But no, I had never before thought of you as a disciple of Spinoza. And your case for the existence of the divine, of God, had a lot to do with physics and a lot to do with the orderliness and of the universe, and I liked it. But I before we go any further, I would love if you could reprise some of it here for any references to the multiverse and the Marvel Cinematic Universe are always appreciated, but not necessary. Make your case.
Well, so I think we've ended up in a very interesting place right now in terms of what the actual scientific consensus is about the system of the universe, how it's set up, how it works, and where human beings fit into it. And these arguments are not the arguments that I make around these issues are not new. Other people have made them for some decades as these realities have sort of become more apparent and more widely acknowledged. But basically, we've ended up in a place where the scientific consensus, I use that term advisedly, it obviously can be contested, but I think it's right. The scientific consensus is that the universe as we experience it, or as we study it, not as we experience it, is extraordinarily fine-tuned. This is the term people use for the things necessary to produce stars, planets, life-bearing planets, biological life, conscious life like ours, and that there are an extraordinary number of possible universes, right? There's no there's no apparent necessity in the laws and constants of the universe. You could have hypothetically many quadrillions of possible universes that were maybe beautiful in their way, but dull and lifeless and empty. And from everything we can see, that should be the default if you're just picking a set of laws and constants at random. And again, the default in terms of at the level of not hundreds, but quadrillions, right?
Sure.
Numbers that are impossible to even wrap your mind around. And instead, we have this universe, which, is a kind of a cosmic jackpot was the title of one book by the physicist Paul Davies. I think that's sort of a good frame. And that's a striking thing. And it's not where I think any form of kind of atheist materialist science from the dawn of the Enlightenment to the present would have expected to end up. And so you have this sort of ongoing argument about whether it's possible to come up with an explanation for why this is the case that doesn't, redound either to the God of classical theism, a God outside of space and time, a consciousness that precedes existence and brings it into being, or some kind of Spinozan pantheism where the universe is itself divine in some way, right? And the best, since you asked for the multiverse, the best sort of materialist theory of the case is that there are, in fact, all of those quadrillions of possible universes exist. And the reason that ours looks so amazingly fine-tuned for life is just that, we're here observing it. And we couldn't possibly observe any of the others because they wouldn't have produced us. This one produced us, so we're observing it. So that explains it, right? It's sort of the idea that you can't have an observer without these conditions. Therefore, you should expect to find these conditions if you are an observer. That's the simplest way of putting the argument. And I think that this. I think there are a few different issues with that argument. One is that it marks, in certain ways, the terminus of what we think of as the modern scientific projects claim to have a special ability to figure out the nature of reality because it takes you basically into the realm of speculative metaphysics. You were basically saying there are all these universes. No, you can't see them. I'm sorry. You can't access any of them, but we know they have to be there. How do we know they have to be there? Because otherwise we'd have to believe in God again. Sort of an odd position for science to have ended up. Secondly, I think a number of people have argued plausibly that in fact the multiverse doesn't actually do away with certain fine-tuning issues. You still perhaps need to fine-tune your universe generating system in order to produce universes. So it's sort of an open question whether this idea even does the work that its advocates want. And then this is just part of the argument in the book. I think my argument for being religious is that you basically have several convergent lines of evidence that point toward the idea that the big old religions were sort of right all along. And what we see in physics is one of them. And then you essentially can see something similar with the persistent weirdness of consciousness and the seeming entanglement between our consciousness and material reality that you get at the level of quantum physics. Again, not something that any sort of reductionist would have expected, where, it appears to be the case under some reasonable interpretations of quantum physics that reality itself only collapses from possibility into necessity when you have an observer present, when you have a mind observing it, which is very, very strange. But I think more consonant with a religious world picture where you have a capital M mind sort of supervening all the time. And then finally, and this is where I'm not really a Spinozan, I have a certain amount of stuff in the book about mystical, supernatural, miraculous experience, which has, I don't think it has persisted and even expanded under allegedly disenchanted conditions that people just, you can strip away the structures of official belief and the requirements of an established church and everything else, and people just go on having crazy experiences, crazy but also fairly consistent across cultures. There's sort of patterns of religious experience, from like generalized, feelings of oneness with the universe to the deep weirdness of near-death experiences. So I think those are sort of the big convergent lines that I draw in the book. The universe appears to have been made with, if not us alone, at least some form of life like us in mind. Our consciousness seems to have some deep and profound relationship to the nature of reality, including the fact that it is capable of not just observing the universe, but in fact sort of understanding it, like reverse engineering it, getting like, if the multiverse existed, it would be pretty amazing that a bunch of randomly generated bipeds on a mediocre planet in the backwater of the Milky Way were able to figure it out, right? That's pretty strange. Even that claim is pretty strange. So it's sort of the cosmos, it's consciousness, and it's the supernatural as, I think, strong converging lines of evidence for the idea that there probably is some kind of God. The universe was probably made with human beings in mind in some way. There's probably life after death. You should probably go to church or synagogue, on the regular. That's the argument.
So I mean, I would be happy to have you back when the book is officially out February 11th, which also happens to be my daughter's birthday.
But you can pre-order it now.
But you can pre-order now, which I highly recommend.
In the
everybody.
scheme, you gain many graces for things. Anyway,
and because obviously this is not something we can, in the time we have allotted, we can kick the tires on completely, and I would love to help you sell books. So if you want to come back on and talk about it afterwards, but to give a taste, an amuse-bouche on all of this, I ask this as someone who, I believe in God for many of the reasons that you allude to here, but I'm kind of institutionally agnostic. And which is another way of saying shamefully lazy. And well, no,
you are as God made you, Jonah. And
that's right. Well, no, part of it is honestly
made.
in this grand scheme that you're describing about the existence of God having to do with all the possible universes that could exist, and the human race are basically the quintrillionth monkey banging on a typewriter, and so we think that that therefore proves all sorts of things. All that complexity stuff makes it difficult for me to say, okay, so then this doctrine is right, but this doctrine is wrong, and you're going to hell if you don't agree with it. And so I want to ask you, as someone who I know is a sincere Catholic, for you to say, go to any, go to a synagogue, go to a mosque, go to whatever, that is not, in fact, the teaching of your faith, right? I mean, the teaching of your faith is he thee to a Catholic church. How do you reconcile that tension there?
So, I mean, in that sense, this is my most liberal book.
Sort of a first taste is free to get people to the Catholic Church.
Well, I mean, the structure of the book, honestly, is written as a kind of like, in certain ways, like a sort of honest trap, right? Where the book is making an argument for it's making an argument for the big religions as the most plausible place to start. So the first part of the book is what I just gave to you, right? The case for thinking there's a cosmic purpose to your life and our podcast right now. And then the second part is a kind of like, slightly self-helpy. So you've decided there might be a God. What should you do next, right? And there it is it's a pro-institutional case, right? And it's saying, you can be institutionally agnostic, but you still should give a certain deference to the big traditions, the big conversations. If God exists, probably you shouldn't discount the fact that Judaism has lasted a really long time, and Islam and Christianity are really big, and you're more likely to get somewhere if you start in those places than if you go super bespoke and hyper individualist. I am probably not a religious genius on our own. So there's value in essentially entering into a larger tradition. And also, the institutions help with the laziness. I'm pretty lazy too. And I have, a lot of kids who don't necessarily want to go to mass every Sunday. It's very useful for me to be part of an institution that tries to demand that of me, even if we're dragging in late and so on. So the institutions are there to help with the laziness. But that's sort of, but then the last chapter of the book is a sort of explanation of why, against this background, I am specifically a Christian, and why I think you can hold two ideas in mind simultaneously, which, is maybe a challenge. But I think that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the second person of the Trinity, and the source of all salvation for the human race. And I think that the revelation in the New Testament is what you might call the controlling revelation through which all the other religious data, which is multifarious and complex, should be read. I think all of that. But I also think that God is not out to trick you. And the fact that there are mystical experiences that have some similarity to the ones experienced by Christian mystics in other religious traditions, the fact that there are ethical codes in other traditions that, have some strong overlap with Christian ethical codes, suggests that God is present in those religions too. And that if you are sincerely convinced that you should be Christian and you don't, then you are in real spiritual danger. But if you're just starting out and you were raised Jewish and you start to go to synagogue again, even if Christianity is the one true faith, you're still making great progress relative to where you began. And this is, in a way, this is obviously like in the great, the endless intra-Christian divides, right? Catholics have always been more likely to emphasize works, the importance of works, the famous moments in the New Testament when Jesus says, he's got the sheep and the goats before him headed into the afterlife. And he's like, well, when you fed and clothed other people, you were doing it to me, even if you didn't know that, right? And, certain forms of Protestantism have been, getting more likely to emphasize more faith and grace, and just the idea that, we're not, our works are sort of as nothing and without Christ. And so in that sense, this is more a post-Vatican II Catholic book in a way. But, the most prominent, in a way, Protestant writer of the 20th century, was C.S. Lewis, great favorite of American evangelicals. And the culmination of C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, The Last Battle, features basically the Narnian apocalypse, and where there's a character who's a Calorman, who's, the bad guys of the Narnian world who worship a vulture demon called Tash. And Lewis makes sure to usher Emeth, this character, into paradise because he was trying to serve God. He was trying to serve the good God who made the universe through the religion that his culture presented him with. And I think that if Lewis can imagine a world where a vulture demon, where, you can make it into heaven even if you're a member of a vulture demon cult, I think that I can reasonably imagine a world where it's not imagine. I think I can reasonably urge people to enter into the spiritual practice that feels closest to them and place some trust in providence that, that act gives God something to work with, I guess you could say. And then the traditionalist side of this, right? It's a very liberal book in a way, but it's also a trad book in the sense that, there's a certain amount of talk about how, there's a lot of bad stuff out there in the spiritual world. And I think this is an important point for our cultural moment, talking about, vibe shifts and everything else. It's a very weird moment in American culture in the religious landscape, because there's just a lot of stuff happening around like psychedelic drugs and UFO fascinations and, sort of magic and witchcraft and all of these things. There's a lot of spiritual energy that is not lazy, but is not interested in religion in its institutional forms and is trying to sort of do or discover something new. And a lot of that is well-intentioned and interesting and sincere, but part of the non-liberal sub-theme of the book is that if you take spiritual realities seriously, you should take dangerous spiritual realities seriously and dark spiritual realities seriously, and be very careful out there.
So I got two questions on that. The first is, how to put it? What is your explanation? I know there are many different explanations, but what is your explanation for why, if God is real, God is present in our lives, and there is evidence of it in terms of, like, one of the things you cite is near-death experiences that have a certain commonality to them, divine experiences, even in this, disenchanted age, all these kinds of things, right? Why is he so sparing in providing the evidence? What is the benefit for, if it's better for everybody to find God, why not in this day and age? You don't have to send Jesus, but send somebody to walk on water, right? Send somebody to do some miracles because in the age where Jesus appeared, miracles were taken as a perfectly plausible, real thing. We live in an age now where miracles beyond the personal kind of thing are not a point of consensus in a culture. Let's put it that way. Why hide the ball as much as God seems to, so that it makes it hard for you to persuade people to get religion?
I mean, part of the claim of the book is that there's less ball hiding than people think, right? And that
some things have to be believed to be seen, kind of thing.
Well, no, that in fact, like the reasons that the typical person has, most human beings have been religious, right? In some form, in some way, throughout most of human history. And the reasons that they have been religious, obviously, some of it is just cultural inheritance, right? But like any cultural inheritance has to start somewhere. But the basic reasons are the world presents itself as, sort of ordered and beautiful and remarkable, and our place in it presents itself as sort of slightly godlike in our capacity to be in it, but also stand outside it, pass judgment on it, analyze it, split the atom, all of these things. And there's a available range of transcendent experiences that give people a sense of connection to whatever power made the universe. That's sort of, I think, the basic pattern of why people have believed in most times and places. I think that pattern is still totally available today. And obviously, like, the details of the scientific consensus sort of swing back and forth on, how plausible an infinite eternal universe is versus special creation and so on, right? But I think in general, that pattern is still there, and it's still just, I think, a decent enough reason to, like, get you in, at least in the direction of religion, before saying, well, why does God not personally, walk on water in front of me tomorrow, right? I also think that I think it's a totally reasonable question to say, why are there not constant big miracles? At the same time, there are not, like, constant big miracles in the Bible, right? Like, we remember the parting of the Red Sea and these sort of moments for a reason. Jesus is a distinctive figure for a reason, right? It's not like everyone was rising from the dead.
Sure.
Right. And
Yeah.
and the claim, and a lot of the things that Jesus does, it's like, all right, some large percentage of the miracles in the New Testament are miraculous healings. And there are, in fact, lots and lots of people in the world today, people who, I'm sure, as someone who knows a number of religious people and some non-religious people who feel like they've experienced miraculous healings. The Catholic Church has had no trouble, even in an age of, serious, rigorous modern medical science, of finding, bizarre healings associated with prayers to saints and potential saints, right? Like, modern science has not created a crisis of saint making in the Catholic Church, even though Catholicism is required to do all kinds of medical investigation of miraculous claims. And I think, again, I guess I'm saying there is some fundamental hiddenness to God and to the divine, clearly. And I think, to the extent that there is some explanation for that, the explanation has to have something to do with the idea that we are not just supposed to always be looking for the supernatural, that we are in fact supposed to exist in material reality, that material reality is good and should be sort of a primary thing that we're interested in, and not just sort of be pulled out of it all the time. I have a lot of skepticism about the ayahuasca bros for precisely this reason. But I think people should take seriously the possibility that, like, if you enter seriously into a quest to, like, have a supernatural experience, right, you might have one. It's not, if and again, not everybody does. And I mean, I'm sort of, my own case, it's sort of, I was raised by parents who were on their own kind of spiritual religious quest when I was a kid. And so I spent a lot of time in Pentecostalist Christianity, where I watched other people have mystical experiences, like hardcore mystical experiences, including my parents, that I myself did not have. And I think, there's some people who would have come away from that saying, like, well, I never had them. Why didn't God give me one? Therefore, I should be a skeptic. I came away with it as a kind of like William James type figure. I accept that I'm not a mystical personality, but that these things really do happen to lots of people, and they are really interesting. And any theory of what is going on in the world needs to sort of fit those in. And I don't think materialism does it very well. So, yeah, I think, again, the Bible is filled with people saying to God, give me a bigger sign, man. I think it's, I think the basic, like, complaints that people have against God, which are, why don't you show yourself more fully? Why do bad things happen to good people? Those complaints are part of the Jewish and Christian inheritance, and we're
Right.
allowed to make those complaints. I just think it's a mistake for those complaints to be a ground for actual atheism, as opposed to a kind of running argument with Almighty God, which is certainly the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, look, I mean, I want to be really clear. I mean, I'm not trying to be dismissive about any of this, and I think that there are enormous flaws with all sorts of forms of atheism and materialism. And I just finished Tom Holland's book Dominion a little while ago, and I'm very persuaded that a big chunk of that atheists are still living in Christianity's world, right? That they are working with Christian concepts that they don't even know are Christian, and that is a testament to whether you want to give Jews partial credit, because through Paul and all that, or not, doesn't really matter.
You always got to give Jews partial credit, man.
Well, I mean,
they're on the ground floor when the whole thing started. So my book is basically trying to talk Tom Holland, who I don't know personally, but I know his work, and like Tom Holland is, he's a guy who has existed in this kind of liminal space for the last 5 to 10 years, where he was a historian of pagan antiquity, and he got really interested in the Christian transition and how Christianity revolutionized the moral landscape of the world, and wrote a brilliant book about it. And since then, it's been going around being like, Christianity is good and it's interesting, and Christians should be more in touch with their own like weirdness and distinctives. But do I believe in an afterlife and so on? I don't know if I can get there. But then he literally had a I don't want to say miraculous, but he had a cancer diagnosis, and he went to the chapel of the Virgin Mary, one of the only Marian apparitions in England, and prayed for help. And he received, again, who knows what will come of it, but some kind of partial healing in a response. So he so he's just an interesting case study where it's like, you're like, okay, can I pull you just a little bit further to say that maybe when you die, you might want to consider the possibility that, that God will be there waiting for you. So that's, but my book is written in part for people in exactly that kind of like, I think religion might be good, but I can't get all the way. And I'm trying to, pull you all the way.
Fair. That's totally fair.
And I'll be calling you the next Saturday to tell you to go to synagogue personally. Everyone who buys the copy of my book will receive a personal telephone call on their respective Sabbath. No, I'm kidding. I cannot back that up.
So one of the things I got from Julian Benda was
so many good sentences start that way.
Yeah, well, was that you can this is a gross paraphrase. It's not, he doesn't say this explicitly, but like you can tell that the teachings of Jesus, of Christianity, are being subverted and corrupted the moment you hear someone say Jesus was the first X, right? So Jesus was the first Aryan, Jesus was the first socialist, Jesus was the first nationalist, and there are plenty of biblical quotes that you can get to superficially support these claims.
Jesus was the first podcaster, Jonah.
There you go, right? I'm sure someone has already said that, and so, and it calls to mind William Rauschenbusch, who I'm sure you're a huge fan of.
Yep.
Grandfather of Richard Rorty, I believe.
Yep. The whole arc of
it's all coming together.
In 3 generations.
Rauschenbusch said, let the God of lower food prices be God. And to me, maybe that's just my Jewish background coming. It's like yoking the almighty of this universe of a trillion multiverses down to egg prices on a Tuesday is a profound insult, it seems to me, to the idea of God, right? And the idea that if God does not endorse your politics perfectly, then we're going to come up with a different conception of God is a sign of the politicization of religion. And I'm just kind of wondering, I see a lot of that as these days. And I see it more on the right these days, but because it's more noticeable on the right these days. But it's always been part of the left. I mean, Rauschenbusch was a huge liberal thinker. I'm just wondering, how does all that play into your schema about getting religion? Because I'm assuming you don't want people to get religion to join a political movement.
No, I think this is a really tricky point, because I want to write a piece about this question. You definitely don't want to sort of use religion, use God instrumentally in order to further not just a partisan cause, but even sort of a broad-based, like we need God, we need the Christian God to save Western civilization, right? Like, I mean, one way or another, like if there's a God, it's not like you're not going to. Well, one, you're not actually going to refound a Christian civilization on an instrumentalist conception of God. Like, it's just not going
Right.
to work, right?
Right.
And two, it is a form potentially of blasphemy, I think, for or at the very least, there's sort of an extreme presumption to imagine that the author of the universe would endorses every jot and tittle of your political platform. At the same time, for the individual finding their way into religious commitment, I don't really have a problem with people saying, I want to believe in God. I don't know what kind of religion to join. I find, but my heritage is this, or I value and love the civilization that sprang from Christianity. And so I'm going to start my religious quest there, right? And in a way, those can sound like two versions of the same thing, but I think they're actually importantly different. That it's like, if when Elon Musk talks about like, the value of belief in God or belief in Christianity or something, I feel like I'm watching someone just instrumentalize religious faith.
Mm-hmm.
But like when Ayaan Hirsi Ali started writing about her own conversion to Christianity, and she talked about like how she felt like these things that she really valued in Western civilization and liberalism were actually rooted in Christianity, and that was sort of her path into faith. She got a lot of blowback from both atheists and religious people that were like, this is not the reason to convert, and so on. And my sense, I think she had deeper reasons to convert, but my sense was that no, that could be a good reason to convert. It's not a good way to set up your politics where God is just an instrument of this other thing. But if you personally are trying to find God, your reactions to politics and culture and who your friends are and like what you're fighting for and so on, I don't have any problem with that as like a way into commitment. But you actually have to make the commitment. Elon Musk is not making a commitment. He's saying it's great if other people believe in God, because that will help save whatever he wants to save. And that I'm against. I just want to say, though, at the outset, like, I don't believe in the trillion multiverses, for the record. I'm willing to entertain the possibility, but I do think this is universe prime, as it were. I want to stipulate that. And I do also think that, like, there's a difference between saying the author of the universe endorses my political program. I think that's almost certainly a big mistake. But could the author of the universe care about you in particular, or your culture, or your society and its fate? Yes. I think there's no reason to think that the kind of infinite consciousness that created this universe with us in some form in mind wouldn't care. It's like, does the author of a great series of novels care about the minor characters in his novel? I think usually he does, right? So again, I would make that distinction. God is not a political endorser, but God does care.
Mm-hmm.
He cares. Message. He cares.
George H.W. Bush as God Man K. Okay. I promise to get you out of here by a certain time. If you can keep going, we can keep going. Otherwise, I'll have you back to talk about the book more.
No, it's good. Yeah, let's do it again. Let's do it again. This was fun.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have you ever read Robert Wright's book, Three Scientists and Their God?
I haven't read that one. No. I've read other Robert Wright.
But like, so this guy Edward Fredkin, who Robert profiled for the Atlantic, I want to say in like 88 or 89, who only died like a couple years ago. One of the foundational guys in computer science.
Yep.
And he basically had this theory that the universe was a computer and basically God. And that's what made, when I was hearing you talk with the other guy about this stuff and why I accused you of rank Spinozaism.
Right. This is the pantheist alternative. Yeah.
Yeah. Pan-computational something or other. And it had a huge impact on me at the time when I read it like in high school or something. But
this is early Robert Wright, and I have not read it, so I should read it.
Some might even say Robert Wright before the fall. But we won't go there.
Come on now. We're all Jonah, we are all fallen. This is the Christian, the Christianity coming out. We're all doing our best.
I promise, because we didn't even get to Will Herberg and all sorts of other things. So I will let's figure out a time for you to come back, and
we can
we'll
do it
you.
again. This was half rank punditry, half the struggle for the soul of Jonah Goldberg.
There you go.
I'm here for it.
Which is basically how most of these podcasts go.